Welcome. On behalf of the Friends of the Harriet Beecher Stowe House, we respectfully acknowledge that the ground on which we stand are traditional Miami and Shawnee lands. We extend our esteem and gratitude to the indigenous people who call this place home. And I want to welcome you all to the Harriet Beecher Stowe House online and the next session of After Uncle Tom's Cabin, Black Voices for Justice series. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the writings of James Baldwin. Our sponsors for the After Uncle Tom's Cabin series are School Outfitters, bringing learning spaces to life, and Hindman, who is an internationally recognized fine art auction house. We're grateful for their support, and you can find more information on both linked to this page on our website. You'll also want to check out our website for info on discussions and lectures and walking tours and current exhibits. We are hosting an outdoor celebration of the new exhibit, our neighborhood story, a tour of this Walnut Hills block on Sunday, September 12th from 1 to 3. And at that event, the Walnut Hills Historical Society is joining us. And in addition to seeing the exhibit on the grounds, we'll take visitors over to the Manse Hotel to show everyone where the new Ohio historical marker will be and to show off the new Artworks mural that's attached to the Manse Hotel. So with all that being said, welcome again, and let's get started with our discussion. We'll go for about an hour, maybe a little bit more. Mute yourself when you're not speaking, but feel free to virtual hand raise or just jump in when you're ready to contribute. Tonight's leaders from Xavier University are Professors John Getz and Professor Tyrone Williams.
Thanks, Chris. Let's get nice to see so many familiar faces and familiar names. Sometimes I can't always see your faces, but welcome, and we're happy to be back for the fall version of this series. So let's start with James Baldwin. This is Black Voices for Justice, James Baldwin, and the Failure of the Protest novel. That's a quote from Baldwin himself. So a little background on Baldwin. Let's look at the chronology together. Some of you have this already. James, 1924 is his birthday. James Arthur Jones was his name when he was born in Harlem. To Emma Burtis Jones, who left Baldwin's biological father, whom he never met or knew, as far as I know. The father had a drug problem, and so Emma left. Volume too loud. Getting more volume here. Okay, she 3 years later, when young Jimmy is 3 years old, she marries the Reverend David Baldwin, a laborer and storefront preacher. And over the years, until 1943, they will have 8 more kids. And there was tension, even though Baldwin refers to David Baldwin as his father, and he has his last name. There was a lot of tension between the two, and from Baldwin's writings, we assume that his stepfather was an extremely strict individual and haunted by a lot of anger that manifested itself in various ways. Young James Baldwin experiences a religious conversion in 1938, and for the next 3 years preaches at Fireside Pentecostal Assembly. He was actually outgrowing his father at that point, which he acknowledged it might have been one of the reasons that he was so drawn to the ministry and felt so good about it. But it only lasted for 3 years. He renounced the ministry while he was, after 3 years, graduates from high school, and then goes to work trying to support all of his brothers and sisters. Contribute to the family money, because David Baldwin, the stepfather, dies in 1943. He meets Richard Wright, who becomes kind of a mentor to him in many ways, starts getting things published, visits France in 1948, and then writes the Everybody's Protest novel in 1949, publishes it which is an attack on, as you know, if you read it, an attack on Uncle Tom's Cabin, but also on Native Son by Richard Wright. Richard Wright was not pleased with this, and there was a strained relationship at best between the two of them for until Wright died, well before Baldwin did. He writes in 1952. He finally finishes Go Tell It on the Mountain, his first novel he'd been working on for 10 years, and it compiles the experiences that will show up in 1953 in Stranger in the Village. If you read that selection, you know he was a unique figure, being the only Black person anybody had seen in that village. Very remote village, not much contact with the outside world. Interestingly, I looked up the village on Wikipedia and discovered that it lists, Wikipedia usually lists famous residents from this place. James Baldwin was the only famous resident listed from this village. So he's there, publishes A Stranger in the Village in 53, a whole book of essays a couple of years later. Sonny's Blues, the short story that you read, published in 1957. He also starts in the late 50s traveling through the South, getting involved very much with the civil rights movement. One of his most famous books, 1963, The Fire Next Time, becomes a bestseller. It's a book of, it's a couple of long essays in letter form that are some powerful writing, and he actually got his picture on the cover of Time magazine. Some of you might have seen that promo that I've posted on Facebook about that, with the cover from Time. In 1965, just a couple of years later, is a famous debate with William Buckley at Cambridge University in England. Baldwin gets an unprecedented standing ovation for this. The crowd was clearly with him rather than with William Buckley. You can watch it on YouTube. I would encourage you to do that. It's very interesting. You'll see Buckley at his most arrogant and obnoxious. One of the more dramatic things that he said was, somebody interrupted him at one point and said, why don't you let people in Mississippi vote? Buckley responded, I think too many people in Mississippi vote already. We don't want Black people to vote, and we don't want a good share of the white people to vote either. Only about 35% of the people in Mississippi or in any state, should be allowed to vote. Pretty startling statement. Some people thought he was kidding, but given Buckley's elitism, that's probably not true. And he said afterwards, Buckley did, they did a vote and Baldwin won the debate overwhelmingly, but Buckley said, but I didn't give them anything. Interesting, in light of the moves to suppress votes these days, Buckley's statement was actually a pretty dire but honest prophecy of what he was trying to accomplish. Baldwin winds up moving permanently to France in '68 after Martin Luther King was assassinated, publishes a book that I found very interesting years ago when I read it, A Rap on Race. He co-wrote with Margaret Mead. They had a big discussion about race. In 1974, he writes If Beale Street Could Talk, which some of you might have seen the movie a couple of years ago, and dies of cancer in 1987. But his relevance is obviously still quite strong. Ta-Nehisi Coates evokes The Fire Next Time, certainly in his book-length letter, Between the World and Me, in 2015. And many of you have probably seen the documentary, I Am Not Your Negro, which uses Baldwin's own words to portray him. So still very strong presence, very much with us and on the minds of younger writers today. Toni Morrison also eulogized him very enthusiastically. So So much for the timeline. Ty, why don't you get us started with the questioning?
Sure. So I guess I'm supposed to start with the essay, Everybody's Protest novel, and the argument in that essay, which focuses primarily, though not exclusively, on Uncle Tom's Cabin, and of course, Native Son by Richard Wright. But he also makes some passing, takes a few passing shots, if you will, at Faulkner and some other modernist novels, as well as some 19th century novels. And so I guess the one question is, to what extent do you agree that Uncle Tom's Cabin is indeed a bad novel? And the same thing presumably is true for Native Son, because according to Baldwin, they're essentially propaganda, protest works, and also sentimental, by which he means an excess of emotion and fairly simply drawn characters, sort of one-dimensional characters. So I guess if you've read both of those, you can respond in terms of whether you agree or disagree with Baldwin. Or either one of those.
Even if you haven't read Native Son, most of you have probably read some of Uncle Tom's Cabin anyway.
Yeah, this is Amber. And yeah, I just cracked up when he said that, and it wasn't really a good book anyway, like how he just said it. But I mean, I can see people's critique of the novel. I think it may just depend on where you are, in your life, and, at the time, Baldwin, and you can see that a lot, in his interviews, he's really fed up. He's infuriated with the United States. And I think just really, he's fed up. And so when you have a character like Uncle Tom, and what I didn't know is that Uncle Tom was that was really the only Black figure, and any of you can correct me if I'm wrong, but that was really the only Black male role model, at one point. It was just Uncle Tom, that's it. That was the only image of a Black man that was traveling around for a while, maybe until Frederick Douglass came along. But yeah, so of course, people are very infuriated by that. A lot of Black people are very upset with that character, Uncle Tom. But I would think for the time that it was written, here is a white woman telling, her people, she's trying to explain how bad slavery is. It seems like it was needed, perhaps, and no, I guess, it wasn't perfect for everybody, which is understandable. And there are a lot of deserving critiques of it. But I think Baldwin, he's just, he's pissed off. He's disgusted. So I think he just, I think he just felt the whole book is bad. I remember, I haven't read it since I was young. I thought that it was, I remember it was hard to read because all the dialects, but I remember enjoying it pretty well. I thought it was pretty engrossing. And that's for Native Son. I loved Native Son when I read it for the first time. And I just thought Richard Wright was the best author ever. So no, I did not. I don't think that Native Son is a bad book. And so it was kind of hard to hear his critique of Native Son. I've never heard anyone critique it or really have anything bad to say about it. So this, well, he critiqued it, right? I shouldn't say he said anything bad about it, but yeah, I guess I can understand what he's trying to say about one-dimensional characters. And so I can hear what he's saying, but it was shocking. And I'm done.
Okay, anyone else want to join in?
So, Dan here. I found, made me reflect on some other novels by other authors that would be in the tone of protest. And it made me reflect on Barbara Kingsolver's novels. Nearly all of them are environmental novels. And I think she's an excellent writer, you know, but I can't understand Baldwin's argument 100 years later. Seems to be that Harriet Beecher Stowe should have got more into the hearts of the feeling of why white people felt the way they did, instead of giving a story of the abuses. You know, there's various ways of writing a novel, but yeah, let's accept it. It's a protest novel. Does that mean all protest novels should not be written? I find that strange.
I find it hard. I don't understand why Baldwin didn't like Uncle Tom, because the character, because I loved him. Okay, I thought he was the epitome of what a person should be. And I know there's some people would argue, well, he should have fought, he should have done this, but and then the fact that he died, he allowed himself to be beaten to death to save those two women. How many people would do that? And I just saw a lot of humanity in him, and the fact that he was passive. I didn't see it in a negative way, but I realized though that view isn't, that's not a view that a lot of people like. They want to see more the warrior or whatever, but I absolutely loved Uncle Tom's Cabin, and I thought it was a great novel, and I'm glad she wrote it.
I found it interesting that within a few paragraphs of starting to critique the piece, he jumped into, well, you know, we've got this little woman writing this little book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, that gets such a great readership, and it's just about as bad as the book Little Women. And I, you know, my feminist ears went, misogyny, misogyny, which I know was certainly something that came through not a lot of, but sometimes in Baldwin's work. His belittling of the author herself, I thought was very telling. But I wasn't surprised because of having some awareness and knowledge of James Baldwin and his own intense arrogance sometimes, as well as his ability to be very skillful at just getting to the very heart of something and being so expressive that by the end of that piece, I appreciated what he was saying, but I felt that he was not looking at it in context, and he was overlaying on an author expectations of what he thought she should have done and how she should have done it, and what she should have portrayed as far as the African Americans in the piece, and overlooked things like her audience, what they didn't know, what they needed to know, what her simple message needed to be in order to reach that audience, and how much time she had to do it in, and the fact that it was in fact it was not one intact social protest novel, but it was a series that was eventually put together into a book. So, you know, she literally evolved this whole narrative and this perspective, you know, week by week. It was like, okay, what do I do now? What do I, you know, how do I get through to these people? He didn't acknowledge that kind of a dilemma, which is a very, very different way of having to approach a subject and communicate about a subject, as opposed to someone who is able to sit down and let me write my social protest novel from beginning to end. Oh, good, here's exactly what I want to say. It was also done 100 years before, and the context, within the context of history, and as you look back 100 years, things look a lot differently from how they might have looked if you were there then. But as I said before, at the same time, I think James Baldwin is in himself brilliant and so well spoken, and I just, while I didn't necessarily agree with what he was saying, or I had issues with his perspectives, I just appreciated the wonderful way that he expresses himself and the words that come out of his mouth and the complexities of his sentence structures. And I enjoyed that piece a lot, although again, I saw it as being very flawed from I guess, a philosophical and an analytical perspective.
I was wondering if maybe the Uncle Tom that Baldwin's talking about was kind of the co-opted Uncle Toms that came through all the, you know, the theater, the stage versions, the minstrel shows. And maybe he was having trouble separating the Uncle Tom from Uncle Tom's Cabin and contextualizing it to 100 years prior to when he's writing this. That was what I was thinking.
But those, I mean, those theatrical figures, of course, came after the novel. And the only thing I was going to say is just in terms of motivation. I mean, I think there are many motivations, including the time period in which this essay is published. But the two things that, or the one thing that Native Son and Uncle Tom's Cabin have in common is that they were wildly commercial bestsellers. You know, Native Son was a book of the month selection. You know, when it was published, it got rave reviews, and it was, you know, a work that was really celebrated. And of course, the same thing is true for Uncle Tom's Cabin. So I think Baldwin, among other things, is sort of linking the popularity of these two books as indicative of a certain, you know, disease, if you will, from his point of view, of American culture and American society.
Go ahead, Amy.
Sorry. So I think Professor Williams just said way better what Wikipedia said when I looked it up, because I actually looked up Invisible Man to get the date on Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, which is 1952. So that would have been around the same time that Baldwin was writing these short stories and essays, I think. And so apparently Wikipedia said it's a specific category, and the only two books that fit in the category of protest novels regarding African Americans is Uncle Tom's Cabin and Native Son. So that could also be why, but I think Professor Williams said it way better than Wikipedia. And the other thing, and I think that was already addressed, was like the attack on Little Women. It just kind of struck me as, and it was the sentimentality of Little Women, because and I don't know how men feel about Little Women, but so many women Little Women resonates with like every girl I've ever met. And that's just me, so I shouldn't make a generalization like that. But you kind of go, yay, girls who are outspoken and say what they want, and to have James Baldwin attack the Little Women was kind of, especially knowing that certain authors like Mrs. Stowe and Miss Alcott were limited to the realm of domesticity already in their time frame, so they were limited as to the scope of what they could write about. But yeah, he's not attacking Dickens, who wrote in the same time period as Harriet Beecher Stowe, and definitely was a social critic. So I just found a lot of that very intriguing.
I thought, like, on page 14, where he talks about how she goes over everything except why white people had slaves, I think he totally misses the whole point of what she was trying to do. Because, like, I feel like people at the time knew why they had slaves. Like, they had slaves because, like, that's how it's been. They believed that, you know, what, you know, inferiority and all that. But, like, I feel like he's just really angry when he's writing this, and I feel like his anger definitely colors how he views any of it. Because I think that he takes Harriet Beecher Stowe and acts like she should be aware of all of the things that at his time people were aware of. And, you know, like, she simplifies some of the things, she, you know, ignores some of the things, but, and I do think that there's probably a lot of, like, white women during, like, the abolitionist movement, but also people who are speaking up for anybody who's oppressed, the people who aren't oppressed. I think they can never 100% feel that and know what it's like, but they speak to the best of their ability. And I think that he didn't see it that way. Like, he saw it as, like, she messed it up and she didn't do what she was supposed to do, even though I think, like, she really cared and she really wanted to show people how bad slavery was, which, by the way, as a history teacher, you know, like, I talk about this, and it's like, why did it matter? Why did it become a bestseller? Why did it travel across the world? And then it influenced people in England to, like, kind of come against what was happening in America with slavery. So I just feel like he was a really angry man, and he probably should have slept on it a couple of nights before he wrote all of this.
It's interesting because I actually like Baldwin's anger, but I wonder whether one of the criteria for judging a protest novel would be its effect on people. I always think of what Joan Hendricks said about Uncle Tom's Cabin, that here was Eliza afraid of losing her child, when for people like Stowe and so many other white parents, they knew what it meant to lose a child. So that what she did was translate an experience that white parents had had for, so that they could understand what enslavement meant to some extent. At the same time, Uncle Tom is not a character that that almost anybody could live up to that moral code. I mean, it's impressive, but to ask people to live up to that level of sacrifice is maybe problematic. But certainly the impact, you know, if you're looking at a protest novel for what is its impact, then Uncle Tom's Cabin did that.
Others? Anyone else want to jump in? Okay. So where should we move on, John, or do you want to?
Yeah, let's go on to the second question, and maybe, you know, we'll continue to pick up on threads from the discussion on the first essay. This one's about Stranger in the Village, and the question says, even when writing about his experience in a Swiss hamlet in Stranger in the Village, Baldwin's always an American, writing about America. The essay is about 70 years old now. How much of this essay strikes you as relevant to the United States today? Why would we read Stranger in the Village today? Anything strike you as contemporary, something that would apply as well to our time as to Baldwin's?
When I read it, actually, honestly, I was reading it last night at about 1:30 in the morning and thinking, why am I reading this? But I was just compelled to read it. I couldn't put it down. I thought it was fascinating. And it's funny you asked that question, John, because that came to me as an overarching question and realization that what he was saying, that whole idea of, you know, I'm always an American and I am a Black man who carries this history and this knowledge and this attitude toward me wherever I go. And it is my history. I can't extract myself from it. It's part of what I have to live through no matter what. And his example of the children of the village calling him whatever the word was, I don't remember, it was nagger or something. And they, he said, had no context from which to do that, except they were laughing because, look at this man is dark and has dark skin. But when they would call him that, it brought back to him the reality of being in America, where the N-word is used in a terribly derogatory way. So their intention was not necessarily derogatory, but it was somewhat childlike and a fascination with the fact that he was different. But the pain that it still brought deep inside of him was very real. And I was thinking a lot about everything that has happened in the last year or two in particular in this country with race relations and, you know, the whole George Floyd situation, and thinking of how when he talked about when you're in darkness and everything is dark, it doesn't go away. It's always there. And living through that and trying to change that history is not something that any of us can actually do and just erase it, because it's as if it's baked into America, which I don't necessarily believe that it can't be changed, but I understand what he was saying and the way he expressed that kind of that reality that America is truly unique because of that enslavement and that attitude towards the Black person and the Black experience that has been baked into our history and can never be erased because it is part of our history. It was very sad for me because, you know, I felt some of my hope going, just, I was less hopeful by the time I finished reading that, but I also felt that it was very insightful for me to have read that piece.
Well, certainly another way of thinking about John's question, which is sort of a, you know, simple version of it, which is that, especially at the beginning of that essay, in terms of, because you said, John, is it still pertinent and relevant today? So one way to think about that is, are there spaces or places where African Americans can walk into where they would get similar reactions of shock and awe and wonder that they were in that particular place?
think we could probably all think of some neighborhoods where that would be true. Not that the people there had never seen a black person, but they don't, there are certainly places where they don't want to see a black person.
On the other hand, I have a African-American friend, I haven't seen him for years now, that told me he had never seen, except on TV, he had never seen a white person until he was 10 years old. And he was fascinated and intrigued when he saw a white person for the first time when he was 10 years old. So isolationists like this, isolating races is pretty strange.
Well, that's, Dan, that's the experience, of course, of almost, not all, but a great number of our first year students at Xavier, because I've had both Black students and white students in their first year tell me that this is the first time they've actually met someone of another race close up. Yeah, so I know, but yeah, that's still a reality for the students, in terms of the places where they come from. I think Amy has had her hand up, maybe.
I got it.
It's a very good student thing to do, raise your hand.
Sorry, it's a habit. I was looking at a quote in the essay. It's on page 3, I think, which to me feels pretty contemporary. It's the 3rd or 4th paragraph. The Black man insists by whatever means he finds at his disposal that the white man cease to regard him as an exotic rarity and recognize him as a human being. And I mean, as was mentioned earlier, just it resonating from last year into this year, that seems to be a very contemporary statement, especially for an essay that's, what is it, 70 years old? So that resonated to me. And the other thing, for later in the essay, he talks about African American identity and white American identity, and how for a lot of, if not all, African Americans, it's difficult to trace their identity back as opposed to people in the Caribbean. And that just reminded me of like all these episodes of Finding Your Roots, where Professor Getz is like trying to trace people's ancestry, and a very common theme with his African American guests is that the paper trail stops after a certain point. It's like almost a universal thing. I think he had one guest where he could trace their heritage back farther than a couple of generations. So those things to me felt kind of contemporary.
I agree. Like that was something that I was just getting ready to say, because it talks about, I don't know what page it is, but it's he's unique among the Black men of the world, that his past was taken from him almost literally at one blow. Because I had been thinking that for my U.S. history class, I think it'd be really cool to do like a genealogy section where like kids could spend some time doing that. And then between this and something else that I had read recently, I was like, well, maybe I shouldn't, because I mean, I could, and it would still be a good lesson. But at the same time, for kids who can't trace it back very far, like that feeling, I think, of a lack of identity or that unfairness. And so I don't really know, like I'm stuck. And it just seems like we've been talking about identity in class a lot lately. And so to me, it just seems crazy that so many people are struggling to find identity today, partly because of what's happened before, but partly because of what's still continuing on today. So, and not just African Americans, but we've been reading about Native Americans and like trying to reestablish like their native language, and just it's crazy just the impact that has on people and whole communities.
I think Amber has her hand up.
Oh, no, it's fine. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Anyone else?
I'd like to respond to Kara's point. I would encourage you to go ahead and do the genealogy with, there may be kids with any kind of background who can't go back very far. And what you could stress is work with what you have, because most parents at least can tell their kids some stories of their upbringing. And maybe if that's as far as you can go into it in depth and really find out what motivated your parents to do different things, or their parents. I think I used to do an assignment like that, and even for a kid who's adopted, there's a dilemma. You know, I don't know my birth parents, or I do, but I identify more with. I just told them pick whoever you want to, and go with that. And I think a genealogy, even if it doesn't go back very far, can certainly teach things, but it can also uncover family stories that are well worth hearing and bringing to light. As long as you don't put pressure on people to go back to the Mayflower or something, because most of us can't do that anyway. So that's my advice about that. I don't know if anybody, I have to ask this question. If anybody was raised Catholic, do you remember doing what he describes in the story of having a box into which you put coins during the Easter or during Lent? I can remember this. I had a box hanging on our wall during Lent, and if you put enough money in there to get to $5, you, and I say this with some embarrassment, you ransomed a pagan baby. Basically, you sent that $5 to the missions, and then it was supposedly used to convert by the soul of somebody. That's putting it much more crudely than they would have put it in those days, but that's kind of what it amounts to. Dan, do you remember that?
Yes, absolutely. Buy a pagan baby. And it would be a class project and individual projects, and you take a box home, and like you said, once you got $5, and then the troubling thing was trying to figure out what you got to name your pagan baby.
Yes, sadly.
Yeah, there's some poor guy out there named Valentine because it happened on Valentine's Day.
Well, I hope they didn't follow through on that. But
I had the unusual opportunity to be in charge of communications and public relations for a major missionary group that was in Italy, but had a big center in Cincinnati. And while the presentation of what they did was social services oriented, ultimately, it became absolutely unmistakable to me that while some of them had the social service thrust, others were using that as a leverage to get in and then change the African religious perspective to one that was Catholic. So conversion was definitely part of the whole package. When it got to the point where I realized that, you know, I was promoting something like that, I had to quit. I couldn't do it. But there was no question that they didn't have the little boxes. They had big festivals where they would, you know, all over the country, where they would raise money in order to enable their missionaries to be effective in their work in Africa. And ultimately, it really seemed like it was an erosion of African culture and an invasion of the religious, the bases of the African religious experience, and trying to, you know, convert. Very real and very, very strong, very strong.
Sorry. Yeah, I think all of this, these anecdotes that we're providing speak to one of the most profound moments in the essay, when he talks about the different reactions when white people show up in a country that's Black, Africa, or they see it as a place to colonize, to conquer, to convert, whereas a Black person showing up in an all-white community, Baldwin. It's my dentist calling for some reason. Baldwin is, if a Black person shows up in a white community, it's more of, well, let's exchange ideas, get to know each other, whatever. Or it's Baldwin doesn't think he's going to convert everybody in the Swiss village to become Americans or to whatever his views are. It's a very different experience, and that goes to the white supremacy analysis that he's doing in here. And I think it's a very, talk about relevance to me. He says the idea of white supremacy rests simply on the fact that white men are the creators of civilization, the present civilization, which is the only one that matters. All previous civilizations simply contributions to our own, and are therefore civilization's guardians and defenders. Well, what have we seen with people marching in Charlotte and so many other places in recent years about white supremacy and protecting Western civilization from who knows what? That's white supremacy. And he was putting his finger right on it when he wrote this essay, I think. And that, and plenty of comments about white fragility in here too, I think. You can, when he talks about how uneasy white people are at acknowledging the humanity of Black people, at confronting people as fellow humans, fellow individuals. It's the very stuff we're talking about today. So I find this essay both powerfully written and very very timely, as if it could be written today. The other one, may be more dated, but this one strikes me as very very contemporary. Any final thoughts on that before we move on to talk about Sonny's Blues? Okay, Ty, you want to take this one?
Sure. Hold on. Well, you can tell me. Okay, I found it. I'm trying to find my questions here. So, well, so one of the things that we can think about that came to mind immediately. So I hope you don't mind if I go off on a different trajectory, John.
Sure.
With this, though I want to come back to the question of sympathy too, but especially in light of Everybody's Protest novel, and to a certain extent even Stranger in the Village. So thinking about this story, what are its characteristics? Yeah, sorry, I sound just like a teacher, but okay. If you think about what he says, what isn't literature, Native Son, Uncle Tom's Cabin, is this an example of, obviously it's an example from his point of view of good literature, Sonny's Blues. And so what's different about this particular short story that qualifies it as literature as opposed to Native Son or Uncle Tom's Cabin, from your point of view? This is just like the classroom. Good.
But can I answer? I think that everything from the multi-dimensional characters to the evolution of the character, the idea of there being, and the process of just even that short story, there are changes in Sonny, there are changes in the brother and his brother. There are life experiences that put a whole new perspective on how they see their world. It's real, there's wonderful dialogue, just wonderful dialogue, as well as wonderful descriptions of lack of dialogue and of darkness and of people in moods that are very ponderous and still hold a lot of meaning. It's beautifully written. and it has so much, there's so much heart and emotion and truth and angst compacted into one, what I think is a work of art that that just puts it on another level completely. I love that piece. I love it.
If I could ask a question about James Baldwin himself, I saw that his father had died of a drug overdose, and so I saw this story a little bit about a personal experiences, but he writes so movingly about the experiences of being under heroin and the experiences of the blues and the combination of those two. Was James Baldwin a user or known to be a user, and did he play a musical instrument?
No, to both of those.
There's no to both of those.
Yeah.
Yeah, wow. So he's able to empathize and speak of those issues in such deepness that it's wonderful. I was very surprised. It's wonderful.
I mean, though it does trade on a stereotype of the blues jazz musician who is, a user, I mean, it's a stereotype that has obviously foundation in, truth, to a large extent. But so he is drawing upon that in his portrait of Sonny.
Can I comment a moment? But one of his brothers was a musician, and which is real prevalent in a film that I think is one of the best films about him, an earlier film from the 80s. And there, he's featured kind of in that film. Now, whether I doubt that he was a drug, a user, but he did have a very musical background. I mean, himself from the church, as you know, and also his brother was in a band. I think in that one collection, there's an essay about that, the journey to Atlanta. And I think that has something to do with, yeah. Just wanted to put that in there.
No, that's great. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot. I mean, I could, Baldwin this story is it's a very interesting story, and Joanne, the things you were saying about it were, I was thinking your description of it, and it's obviously written completely. It's a completely different rhetoric and lexicon, and in relationship to Native Son. But it strikes me, in not just Native Son, but it strikes me as odd, or maybe not odd, but so these are very complicated characters who shift and move and so forth. And of course, his critique, one of his critiques of Uncle Tom's Cabin is that there's just one type of black person presented, they're just one dimensional. But you might recall in that essay, he deals with, I think it's George and Eliza, and he says, who aren't like Tom, but he says they aren't really black because they aren't like Tom, they're like white people. And so when Stowe does present, a certain variety of African Americans, he's dismissive of it because they aren't really African Americans. But I think that just points to the fact that, he's clearing space for his own kind of writing, his own kind of aesthetic. And he has to take down, these two pillars, Stowe and of course his mentor, Wright, Ellison, of course, this is a whole different thing. Ralph Ellison did the same thing to Richard Wright too, who, anyway, sorry, I'm going off on deep end here. I'll just stop.
What I also noticed in this piece was that whole idea of history and the fact that history is baked in and it's part of who you are. Whether you even know what the history is, you are always part of it and you are living it. And the point where the mother reveals after the fact that the pain that her husband and that their father had been through because of the death of his own brother, and how, unbeknownst to them, that had obviously affected his life and probably how he even treated them and what he expected of his own sons. And then what she laid on the narrator, because of this history, then you have to be the brother that helps your brother Sonny through this. And so again, that same history continues, repeats, and moves on to the next generation, and he can't escape it. And when he leaves to go to the service, when he doesn't see Sonny for a long time, he is still haunted by the responsibility, the expectation of his parents, the hell that his father had lived through, and he carries all of that with him. And even to the very last lines of that short story, it's ingrained in him, it's in his heart, it's in his soul, and it's in his conscience. He feels like he is failing to live up to whatever this history that he is a part of and that he is supposed to move on with, and he's just not doing a good job of it. And it I think has a tremendous effect on him as a character. And it's an interesting way of his portraying somebody who does what he theoretically talked about in a couple of in the earlier essays.
So one of the questions is sympathy, in terms of who do we sympathize with? And does our sympathy change? Do we identify with one character more at the beginning of the story as opposed to the end of the story?
I, to be honest, didn't read all of this one, but I do feel like at the beginning, I felt more for the narrator and then started feeling worse and I guess more sympathy for Sonny. But one of the things that I was thinking about with some of the other questions you've asked, and part of why I felt that for Sonny, I think, was like on the first page, I think, or so, it talks about algebra. Page 123, yeah, like halfway down, it says maybe it did more for them than algebra could, like the drugs did more for them. And I think like the only way for anyone who is, socioeconomic status is lower is either school or the military, which they touch on both of those. And I think the idea of that feeling of being trapped for Sonny and not being able to do what he wants to do, I think, like talking to my kids in high school all the time, they don't want to be in school and they just want to get out and they just want to do what they want to do. And it's like, I want you to do what you want to do, but that's not the way the world works. Like, I want it for you. And I think that's kind of like what's going on here. And so I think part of that is what pulled me over to Sonny, because he talks that scene where he's talking about playing music. And his brother's like, well, but is that, it's the real world. You gotta do something that you don't always get to do what you want to do. And he's like, but you should. That's why it's like, shouldn't life be? And so I think that was just really powerful to me.
So another question that John asked, and that was about the question of the occupation of the narrator as an algebra teacher. What are we to think about that? And does that, first of all, does that explain his attitude, complicated attitude toward his brother? and not just toward his brother, but also to the boys in his class. You remember there's a lot at the beginning said about what he thinks about the apparently all boys in his classroom. So what do we think about him being an algebra teacher?
Not necessarily the algebra part, but just being an African-American teacher really plays into the, I'm joining the middle class. This is the only way that I can, take care of my own family. And it really, that goes back to the ideas of these are his duties and what he feels like he needs to do to make things better for his own family. And he doesn't see Sonny partaking in that. And so it's like, he's got his ideas of what he needs to do. And it really, it is a way for, African-Americans in 1950, there are not a whole lot of job opportunities in terms of being able to move into that middle class, but teaching would have been one of them if you were teaching within an African-American circle back then, as opposed to, you wouldn't have been able to get an integrated teaching position. But if he was teaching within an African-American school, that would have propelled his own family forward, and that's what he was looking for. But he sees Sonny as not having that ambition, not wanting to do that. I'm not sure if that really answered the question, but.
And just to throw, another factor into this, the change, the gradual change of acceptance that he has toward his brother, is that motivated at least in part by the death of Gracie, his daughter? Because presumably, Chris, you were saying that this was a way of this particular being a teacher is a way of getting to the middle class, security, and so forth. And yet the death of his daughter, is a kind of wild card, that he could not do anything about. Money, no amount of money could save his daughter in this context. So is that death important in terms of the changes that he makes in relationship to his brother?
I noticed that he kind of wanted his brother to be maybe a classical musician,
Right.
Which is kind of a practical thing, like being a math teacher. There's something about math where when you learn a certain concept, you get this great aha moment where it's a kind of not really an epiphany, but you get it. At the end of the story, when he sees Sonny play, the first set, he's kind of, maybe not. And then all of a sudden, he gets it. He hears the jazz, he hears the communication, he sees his brother as a success.
Mm-hmm. So you're drawing connections between the math that's needed to understand musicianship with the narrators?
Right. It's almost like they're both kind of learning from each other. Jazz is really, there's something about it, you can just feel it and get it. When you get that math, when you really understand it, it's such a breakthrough, and it's so easy when you get it. He just got it at the end, and it felt like he kind of, realized that his brother was doing something good. His brothers were respected among that community. So in other words, it's not just a black and white thing like, oh, you're either practical or you're not. You're either playing at Carnegie Hall or you're playing in a dirty jazz club somewhere.
I have a question about the character that comes in at the very end that pulls Sonny into performing so well. Sonny's not performing well. He's not connecting. And this bass player sort of stops things and lets things go, and then starts it all over again because he knew Sonny would pull through. But he had to give Sonny that kick in the pants in some way with the bass break that he did, and then suddenly came through. I found that wonderful, but it was like, okay, Sonny wasn't succeeding, and somebody helped him succeed. Somebody came in and helped him succeed at that one moment.
And I was,
yeah, go on. I'm sorry.
I was so worried that they were going to step into the back room and take some heroin and come back and play, because there was some kind of thing like, well, we have to have this thing to feel it right or something. And it was such a relief to see what you said. Yeah, that they pulled each other through, they play off each other, and there it was. And gosh, what a relief.
Although it's not, the story is ambiguous because it's not as though, Sonny, there's no indication that Sonny has quote unquote kicked the habit. So we don't know going forward what's going to happen, because you recall when he describes what it feels like, it's very close to the sensation of playing music. He draws a direct link between those two things. And so even though the story ends with him playing music and getting that quote unquote that kind of high, that doesn't necessarily mean that he won't be, going for the other kind of high, beyond the story, as it were. But I think that the story suggests that, at least he's found this other outlet now. It's not just one thing. It's not just like his friend, the guy who's an addict, who only has that one thing. That's all he has. Now Sonny has at least two things. So.
When Sonny, what happens especially is I think that his brother finally gets it and finally can relate at a level that is meaningful to Sonny, and that it leaves on a hopeful note that perhaps the brother and son, he will help Sonny along and stay connected with him in ways that he hasn't before, because somehow through his music he has started to really hear Sonny and understand him. And that to me was perhaps one of the best parts of that ending, that he sends up drinks to all of them as kind of a little way of cheering for this performance. And even Sonny acknowledges that and looks back at the brother and, takes a swig of his drink, almost as if it's a toast, let's to us and to the future. And I thought that was it was a small gesture, but it was a sensitive gesture. And again, it was just part of I think the brilliance of the writing that he put something like that into it.
All right, how about Amy? And then I'm going to have John close us out because it's already 8:10. Go ahead, Amy.
I'll be brief. I was just going to say, to answer the earlier question, maybe structurally, it looks like in the story, I get a sense that Grace's death was impactful as far as restoring their relationship, because it's on page, I don't know what page it is. It's on page 9 in the PDF, but the top paragraph, the narrator is talking about the fight that he had with Sonny, and then the very next sentence is, the last sentence of that paragraph is the song, "You're Gonna Need Me Baby One of These Cold Rainy Days." And then he talks about learning about Sonny's troubles, and then he talks about Grace, and then he comes back to Sonny. So I kind of read it structurally that there was definitely an impact, that her death had a definite impact in restoring their relationship.
Yeah, that's really a turning point in the story, I think. Grace dies and the narrator realizes he can't use a formula to explain everything in life. And Sonny speaks to the chaos that has entered, that has always been there, but the narrator is now aware of it. So we're doing closing comments just for a minute, Chris? Okay. Ty, do you want to go first, or you want me to go first?
You can lead off, I guess.
Okay, just really fast, the Henry Louis Gates lament that maybe Baldwin is sadly Harriet Beecher Stowe's legitimate 20th century heir. I'd say it's not such a bad thing if he is, because both of them were essentially preachers. Baldwin was one when he was young and became a civil rights preacher basically in his later years. Stowe would have been a preacher if women were allowed to do that. And Baldwin and both of them got very involved in the issues that they saw in their day. Both were public figures, not afraid to address big issues. Baldwin's clearly the more polished writer, but he still writes with a great passion for his subjects. There's really, while the richness of Sonny's blues can't be contested, the affirmation of Black American culture is certainly very strong. There's no ambiguity about that. Baldwin's views about race relations, for all of the things we've been saying tonight, are pretty clear, straightforward, much as Harriet's attack on slavery was straightforward, whatever her lack of subtlety in doing that was. Ty, closing thoughts?
Well, one of the things that's interesting about Baldwin is that in the 60s, and this happened to a number of writers, including Ralph Ellison, but also others, is that with the rise of the Black Arts Movement, which was all about, for the most part, protest literature, Baldwin suddenly found himself on the outs. And like Ellison, he was taking the task for his quote-unquote white writing. And Baldwin was, obviously very hurt by this. And so his response, unlike Ellison's, was to join the party. And so he became much more militant on some levels. I mean, not in terms of advocating violence, but he certainly changed and became much more, shall we say, of a protest essay writer to a certain extent. And many people, critics, have argued that in doing so, he may have damaged his narrative writing, his literary or aesthetic writing, that because he wanted to prove that he was still relevant in the context of the 60s and the 70s. So it's, I find myself sympathetic to him in that, because it's almost as though the very things that he used against Stowe and Wright came back to bite him in the 60s and 70s. Suddenly he was the, one-dimensional, irrelevant writer.
All right. Well, again, thank you all for joining us this evening. As always, I have enjoyed discussing and talking with all of these different ideas. Go back to our website to look at all the upcoming events, including the next iteration of this series, which will be October 6th. And we have planned Alice Walker, The Search for Black Women's History, as the topic for that one. So find the readings, find the sign up, and we'll see you again next month. Thank you all. I appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.